Hi, my name is Jeff Weiss. I'm a partner in the International Trade Group at Venable in Washington, D.C. Welcome to this webinar on regulatory coherence in Mexico. This webinar is a result of an initiative undertaken by the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed, as part of the U.S. Agency for International Development's Standards Alliance project, which is overseen by the American National Standards Institute. The goal of the initiative is to promote regulatory coherence, including central coordination and good regulatory practices, and to provide capacity building and assistance to the governments of targeted developing countries in Latin America, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and the CAFTA-DR countries. This initiative has two components. Tier 1 covers the Regulatory Coherence Initiative, which is horizontal and cross-sectoral. Tier 2 is about promoting regulatory coherence in the medical device sector specifically. This webinar is part of Tier 1. As part of Tier 1, we've developed a formal internationally benchmarked manual and implementation guide for policymakers to legally codify and implement foundational regulatory coherence policies in the project countries. Next, we conducted an assessment of the existing regulatory coherence policies in 4 of those countries, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, against the manual and implementation guide. Based on that assessment, we've developed a gap analysis report for each country in English and Spanish, plus a flowchart demonstrating the life cycle of a typical regulation in each of those countries. This webinar discusses our findings with respect to Mexico. But before we go into Mexico specifically, I want to provide a general overview on what is regulatory coherence. Regulatory coherence refers to the degree of central coordination and review under which the whole of government works to ensure that regulations and regulatory policy reflect good regulatory practices, or GRPs. Regulatory coherence is important because it enhances regulatory outcomes, legitimacy and predictability, and reduces the risk of creating trade barriers. Regulatory coherence has 2 main components: central coordination and GRPs. Now let's take them in turn. So in terms of central coordination, in order to ensure that all of the GRPs are well understood and followed across agencies, it's critical that a government have a central coordination and oversight body or mechanism responsible for managing the regulatory process and ensuring adherence to a published set of GRPs that are endorsed at the political level, applied government-wide, and revised over time as best practices evolve. Such a body or mechanism can also ensure that there is political level buy-in and accountability on a whole of government strategy for regulatory reform that sets out clear objectives, establishes an effective implementation mechanism to coordinate and manage the strategy, and emphasizes the importance of a marketplace that's open and pro-competitive, facilitates investment, and rewards innovation. Turning now to good regulatory practices, or GRPs, GRPs ensure that the regulations that are developed are high quality and evidence-based and are crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner. And GRPs include things like regulatory forecasting, regulatory analysis, such as RIA, requesting public comments and taking them into account, doing a pro-competitive analysis and an assessment of international impact, and ex-post review. So this is a very high-level overview of the elements of reg coherence. For a fuller discussion, please watch the webinar on major elements of regulatory coherence, which is posted on the Standards Alliance website. So let's first talk about central coordination in Mexico. In Mexico, the National Commission for Regulatory Improvement, or Connemara, is the central coordinating body for regulation. Now, Connemara, until recently, was COFEMER, the Federal Commission for Regulatory Improvement. So it changed to a National Commission for Regulatory Improvement with passage and signing of the General Law on Regulatory Improvement in May 2018. Now, that law has not been fully implemented yet. Many of the details are designed to be elaborated through subsequent regulatory and policy development, and it's also unclear how the incoming Mexican administration will implement the law. So for purposes of this webinar, which is taking place in September 2018, I'm going to discuss regulatory coherence in Mexico before passage of the general law, and then towards the end of the webinar, we'll discuss in detail the general law's key provisions so that you can see how regulatory coherence in Mexico might change. So Connemara, which is part of Connemara, has the authority to review the national regulatory framework, draft regulatory measures, and the performance of regulations through the ex post regulatory impact assessment process. And it also makes proposals to the president regarding improvements to the national regulatory framework. Connemara is large for a central coordinating authority. It's comprised of over 120 public servants, and 40 of them draft opinions on draft regulatory measures. Most of the public servants who work at Connemara are economists and lawyers, but the agency also employs scientists and statisticians. Connemara is organized under 4 general coordinators, each of whom covers specific regulators and areas of regulation. So one coordinator covers measures taken by the president, the attorney general, and Connemara. A second covers health and environmental measures. A third covers measures on social development and indigenous peoples. And a fourth covers measures related to energy, electricity, telecommunications, and transportation. Connemara's main role is to review draft regulatory measures and to promote interagency coordination and transparency in regulatory development. And the draft regulatory measures that they review are both general administrative acts and norms. Norms are official Mexican norms, which are mandatory technical standards. And those are actually considered technical regulations under the WTO Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, or the TBT agreement. So technical regulations, that's a term we should define since we'll use it many times in this webinar. Technical regulations are product regulations, rules that set out product characteristics, related processes and production methods, related labeling and packaging requirements, and any applicable administrative provisions. And it's important to note that, so norms are technical regulations, but general administrative acts in Mexico can also be technical regulations. So Connemara has authority to review all draft regulations, both norms and general administrative acts, from all Mexican federal agencies, irrespective of the level of economic impact, with certain exceptions. And Connemara reviews and opines on draft regulations by assessing the measures themselves as well as the RIAs required from agencies proposing the measures. Connemara's non-binding opinion is not required to publish a draft regulatory measure for comment on Syria, which is Mexico's online regulatory portal. However, that non-binding opinion is required before the agency can publish a final measure in Mexico's official gazette. So in other words, the agency that has having a rule reviewed by Connemara technically does not need to take Connemara's comments into account and follow Connemara's opinions and recommendations. However, Connemara's opinions can be relied upon by parties in any subsequent judicial proceedings regarding the measure as an indication, although a negative opinion is not binding on the court. And it's not uncommon for Connemara to issue opinions with negative views and recommendations. But an agency needs Connemara to issue the final opinion before it can publish the regulation in the official gazette. So that provides Connemara with leverage to push for changes in the measure. So if Connemara decides to withhold issuance of a final opinion in a particular case, it could compel that certain changes be made to the regulation. And we understand that this can and has happened. And so our assessment is that Connemara review is de facto binding. Now, Connemara also has an important role to play at a systemic regulatory level. So it reviews existing regulatory measures with the objective of reducing the number of regulations or simplifying regulations. It develops draft laws and administrative programs to improve regulatory measures in specific economic sectors or activities. It promotes and encourages federal agencies to adopt best regulatory practices, such as RIAs. And it promotes regulatory improvement at the state and local level through collaboration agreements. Obviously, that will be updated under the general law, which we'll get to later. In the case of NOMs, Mexican law also incorporates some best regulatory practices for their preparation. So this is specific to NOMs. So first of all sectors affected by a NOM should take part in its preparation or modification. This is about making sure that the folks that are contributing to it are representative. Second, you need consensus from all interested sectors in approving or modifying a NOM. Third, transparency is very important during the preparation or modification of a NOM. Fourth, rationality as a principle, right? You need to have an RIA and Connemara's regulatory improvement process. Ensure that there is a basis, an evidentiary basis for the NOM. And fifth, review. At least every 5 years, all NOMs need to be reviewed by Connemara to determine whether they're obsolete or have become outdated due to technological developments, or whether they require to be harmonized with international standards. If either of these is the case, the NOM needs to be modified or eliminated. Connemara must also submit to the Mexican Congress an annual report that includes all regulatory measures it has reviewed during the past year. And under Mexican law, federal agencies should submit to Connemara at least every 2 years a program for improving how they regulate, as well as reports on their progress. Connemara has published guidelines for agencies in the Official Gazette on how to conduct these biennial programs. An agency needs to prepare a draft program, publish it for public comment online, and respond to each comment. And after Connemara provides an opinion and recommendations on the draft program, the agency publishes the final program. So that's central coordination. Let's talk about how Mexico implements some of the core GRPs. And let's start with regulatory forecasting. So a regulatory forecast is a central electronic publication, ideally updated no less than every 6 months, of all planned and ongoing regulatory activity. Mexico actually does not maintain a regulatory forecast for measures of general applicability. However, the General Directorate of Standards, or DGN, which is part of Economia, manages the National Standardization Program. And that program lays out an annual plan for NOMs, which, as we've noted before, are technical regulations, and NMXs, which are voluntary standards. And the information contained in the program is provided by regulatory agencies, as well as national standardization bodies and national standardization committees. Turning now to National Regulatory Register. So a register is a central electronic publication issued with regular frequency that solicits stakeholder input on all draft regulations and provides links to the full text of such regulations, as well as their associated dockets. So in Mexico, all draft regulatory measures, including draft NOMs, are published online. The Mexican online system is called SIRIA. Through SIRIA, Mexico publishes and informs all interested parties of the opportunity to comment on draft regulatory measures. The information provided on SIRIA includes the text of the draft regulatory measure, the corresponding RIA, the public comments, and the opinions issued by Connemara. In addition, draft and final NOMs, draft and final conformity assessment procedures, as well as replies to public comments on such measures are published in the NOMs catalog, and all draft and final NMXs are compiled online. All final regulatory measures are published in the Official Gazette. Turning now to the public comment process in Mexico. All draft regulatory measures and their RIAs that are submitted to Connemara are published on Syria, right? They're published there for comment, and they're later published in the Official Gazette when finalized. Mexican law does not specify the duration of the comment period. However, Connemara is required to consider the comments submitted by interested parties through Syria when rendering their opinion on a draft regulatory measure. The regulator also needs to demonstrate to Connemara that it considered the comments and made changes to the measure as a result, and agencies are required to respond to the comments submitted by interested parties. Connemara publishes all of the comments on Syria unless the commenter requests that its comments not be made public. And Connemara has to consider all of the comments before finalizing its opinion on a draft regulation. For NOMs, there are a few differences in the development process. First of all, NOMs are developed by national standardization consulting committees in which private sector entities participate. Mexican law and regulation require agencies to provide a minimum of 60 calendar days for public comments on draft NOMs. At the end of the comment period, the coordinating committee that oversaw the process of developing the draft NOM needs to consider and respond to the comments, including explaining why certain comments were not taken into account in the final NOM. All draft NOMs are also notified to the WTO by Mexico's national TBT contact point since they're technical regulations. And it's important to recall that while regulators develop technical regulations through the NOM process, general administrative acts can also turn out to be technical regulations. One last note, conformity assessment procedures, which define the way in which the NOMs need to be complied with, those are subject to similar international rules to technical regulations. And the procedures that are applicable to both under Mexican law are also quite similar. Public consultation, delayed entry into force, the need for an RIA, for instance. But it's important to recognize that conformity assessment procedures can also be part of a NOM. And for the past several years, the Mexican government has actually made an effort to place a conformity assessment procedure for each technical standard within the NOM. And there are conformity assessment procedures that apply across sectors and conformity assessment procedures that apply only to a specific set of technical standards. So it's something to keep in mind. Let's turn to regulatory analysis in Mexico. Mexican law requires agencies to submit all draft regulatory measures to Connemara and to attach an RIA where the measure would impose compliance costs on citizens. So that's the trigger, compliance costs on citizens. And Connemara has developed an RIA manual, and that lists the different types of RIAs that may be required to be submitted with the draft regulatory measure, and the content that each RIA must include, depending on the level of anticipated impact that the draft measure will have. Interested parties can submit comments related to the draft measure and or the RIA. If the RIA does not satisfy Connemara, Connemara can request the agency correct it for issuing a final opinion on the draft measure. And a final opinion, as we discussed before, is required before the final regulatory measure can be published in the Official Gazette. Agencies have complete freedom to modify a regulatory measure if the modification doesn't create new or stricter requirements or procedures. But if a proposed modification to a draft regulatory measure adds new requirements, it will need to submit a new RIA with the proposed modification. In the event that a new requirement is added, the agency needs to inform Connemara through the electronic RIA system. If Connemara determines that the draft regulation has been substantially modified, Connemara can require the review process to start over from the beginning. So So to determine, so we know an RIA is required when you're imposing costs on citizens. Now moving to determining the types of RIA analysis that an agency needs to prepare and submit to Connemara, agencies are required to use 4 primary tools, right? The regulatory impact calculator, the competition impact checklist, the risk impact checklist, and the foreign trade impact checklist. So let's go through each of these. Regulatory impact calculator. So the regulator uses that tool to identify, for example, all the expected impacts of the draft regulatory measure, the number of affected parties, and the number of years over which impacts are expected to occur. Based on the answers, the calculator will then indicate to the regulator what type of RIA it needs to perform. And there's 3 types: low impact, medium impact, or high impact. And the results of the calculator are sent to Connemara. Competition impact checklist. This tool requires the agency to answer 14 questions that are designed to determine, for example, whether the draft measure would limit the number or range of suppliers, the ability of suppliers to compete, or the choices and information available to consumers. Based on the answers provided, the competition impact checklist tool will indicate to the regulator whether it needs to perform a competition impact analysis. The third tool is the risk impact checklist. This tool requires the regulator to answer questions to determine whether the draft regulatory measure is designed to reduce risks for human, animal, or plant health, public security, labor hazards, consumer protection, or the environment. Depending on the answers, the risk impact checklist tool will indicate to the regulator whether it must perform a risk impact analysis. And then finally, you have the foreign trade impact checklist. So under that checklist, you're asked questions about international trade, international standards. You take into account all the different WTO commitments and your commitments in other free trade agreements. Depending on the answers, the foreign trade impact checklist tool will indicate to the regulator whether it needs to perform a foreign trade impact analysis and whether the measure must be notified to the WTO. And if that's the case, DGN and Economia get a notification when the agency completes the calculator and submits the information to Connemara. And I mentioned earlier that general administrative acts could be technical regulations. One of the objectives of the RIA on international trade is to ensure that a general administrative act that is not following the NOM process, but that still fulfills the definition of a technical regulation, is still notified to the WTO. The regulator may need to perform 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these analyses in an RIA, depending on the results of the calculator, and the level of analysis on regulatory impact varies based on whether it's going to be low, medium, or high projected impact. So as a result, there are a lot of different types of RIAs that an agency may need to complete and submit to Connemara. Lots of variations. In addition, there are 2 other types of RIAs that a regulator may be required to prepare. So one is a periodic updating RIA. So where a regulatory measure is being updated, but the updated regulatory measure is not expected to impose any additional obligations, Connemara can require this type of RIA. It updates the substantive analysis of the initial RIA, but doesn't develop an entirely new analysis. Second, a regulator may need to prepare an emergency RIA where specific criteria are met. So when the draft measure won't remain in force for more than 6 months, it's designed to address an immediate harm, no previous emergency RIA has been prepared in relation to the same issue. Now, Mexican law also requires that an RIA be submitted with a draft NOM. And there are specific rules for those types of RIAs. Those RIAs must need to explain the goal pursued by the NOM, the standards being proposed, the alternatives that have been considered and the reasons for rejecting them, a comparison of the NOM with existing regulations, and a general description of the advantages and disadvantages of the NOM, as well as the technical feasibility of demonstrating compliance with the NOM. Let's look at a couple of other areas of regulatory analysis, starting with science. So in Mexico, as we discussed before, Connemara has issued the RIA manual, and the RIA manual requires that a risk analysis be undertaken when the high-impact RIA form is used for a draft regulation. The manual also encourages agencies to, whenever possible, include the empirical information backing their assertions, as well as sources. And this can include studies by Mexican and foreign universities, domestic, international, and foreign standards dealing with similar problems, government research documents, documents and studies by international organizations, foreign documents and studies, and non-governmental organizations, documents and studies. Turning to competition analysis. So we know that there's a risk impact checklist that you may have to do a risk impact analysis in certain circumstances. It's a high impact RIA. You need to do one by default. There's also, as we discussed before, a competition impact checklist. As a result of that checklist, you may need to do a competition impact analysis. And that is coordinated between Connemara and Mexico's Federal Commission for Economic Competition. And they have a collaboration agreement under which the Commission will issue opinions regarding provisions of draft regulatory measures that could affect competition and the free operation of markets. And the Competition Commission can also require such an analysis, a competition analysis, in instances when it determines that a draft measure will impact competition, even if the calculator didn't detect it. So they can step in and request that and require that anyway. And for a recent example of one of those opinions that the Competition Commission can issue, in July 2018, the Competition Commission issued an opinion in which it recommended to Connemara that it revise a draft technical regulation on milk powder. And in the Commission's view, the draft technical regulation was stricter than the Codex standard, and it wasn't in accordance with best practices in the sector. So as a result, if implemented as drafted, the technical regulation would create barriers to competition in the Mexican market, increase costs for industries that use milk powder as a raw material, and limit the availability of different milk powder qualities for different uses. So that's a recent example of an opinion from the Competition Commission. So international impacts, as we discussed before, there's the foreign trade impact checklist. Depending on the outcome there, the regulator may need to draft a foreign trade impact analysis. And the regulation, so in addition to that analysis, a draft regulation can only be issued if it complies with Mexico's international obligations pursuant to the ACR, or the Regulatory Quality Agreement. And let's talk about that for a minute. So that comes up before Connemara issues its final opinion. It analyzes the draft regulation and the accompanying RIA to determine whether the draft measure complies with the ACR. And the ACR requires that the draft measure can only be issued under the following conditions. The regulator has complied with its legal obligations. The draft regulation complies with Mexico's international obligations, which is what I was talking about earlier. And third, the draft regulation's competition and market efficiency benefits exceed its costs. Let's talk about the use of standards and regulation in Mexico as well. So under Mexican law, Mexico has long relied on standards developed by certain bodies, for example, ISO, IEC, and Codex, but not others. Now, recent trade agreements, specifically the Pacific Alliance and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, contain provisions that define international standard as a standard that fulfills the WTO-TBT Committee's 6 principles for international standards development. So the definition of international standard in Mexico is potentially wider now. There are 2 potential entry points for standards into the Mexican regulatory system. So first, when developing a draft measure, DGN, in the case of NOMS, and other regulators consider the use of international standards. as well as NMXs. So at that point, that's one potential entry. The second area is that stakeholders can participate in the process through which Mexican national standards bodies develop NMXs. And DGN has recognized 10 bodies in Mexico to develop NMXs, and each has a specific scope that it is not permitted to exceed, at least in theory. So, for example, ANSI is the national standards body for the electrical sector. In cases where a regulator may not view a particular standard as international, it may still be willing to use the standard if it's part of an NMX. So that provides the second potential entry point if stakeholders participate in the process through which Mexican national standards bodies develop NMXs. Next, let's talk about entry into force. Mexican law establishes that a general administrative act enters into force on the date it's published in Mexico's official gazette unless the regulator decides otherwise. NOMs, on the other hand, don't enter into force for at least 60 days after publication. Because in some instances, international agreements require that a NOM normally enter into force no sooner than 6 months after publication. For example, the reasonable period of time in the Pacific Alliance TBT chapter is normally not less than 6 months. Before we get to a life cycle of the regulation in Mexico, let's talk about ex post assessment as well. So Connemara created an ex post RIA procedure for agencies to use when evaluating whether a regulation has met its objectives after it has been in force for a certain time. Ex post evaluation for general administrative acts in Mexico is voluntary, but Mexican law requires that NOMs are reviewed every 5 years when they are analyzed with a high-impact RIA. The standard is whether the NOM is obsolete or it has become outdated due to technological developments, or whether it requires harmonization with international standards. If that's the case, the NOM should be modified or eliminated. Connemara can also request that an agency conduct an ex post evaluation of any NOM within 1 year after it enters into force. So let's put this all together and go through the life cycle of a regulation in Mexico. Starting with the sources of authority to regulate. And like the other project countries we looked at, it's the same in Mexico. Regulations are either required by law or they're promulgated under an agency's general authority at its discretion. So step one, the regulator develops the draft regulation. To develop the draft, the regulator creates a working group that may include interested stakeholders. The regulator is required to prepare an RIA for any draft regulation that would add costs to citizens. If the regulator believes that the draft regulation wouldn't add costs, it can indicate as such to Connemara. If Connemara agrees with the regulator's assessment that it won't impose costs, the regulator won't be required to submit an RIA. If Connemara disagrees, however, the regulator will either need to eliminate the costs or conduct an RIA. To determine whether a draft regulation adds a cost to the citizen, Connemara examines 4 areas of the draft regulation. Does the draft create new or stricter obligations for citizens? Would it add to or modify an administrative burden? Does it reduce or restrict citizens' rights? And could the draft affect citizens' rights or obligations or impose administrative burdens in the future? Now, assuming the regulator has to complete an RIA, it must also determine what type of RIA to conduct using the 4 calculator tools we discussed earlier. And when the regulator submits its responses, the system indicates if the draft measure needs to be notified to the WTO and alerts DGN and Connemara. Step 2. The draft regulation is subject to public comment. The regulator needs to submit the draft regulation and the RIA to Connemara at least 30 business days before the draft regulation is expected to enter into force. Unless the regulator received an exemption from Connemara, so for example, the regulation did not impose costs, Connemara publishes the draft regulation and its corresponding RIA for public comment on Syria. As discussed before, there's no minimum comment period for general administrative acts, but there's a 60-day minimum comment period for norms. For each draft regulation on the Syria website, you'll find the text of the draft, the RIA, the public comments, and the opinions issued by Connemara. The regulator considers the comments, and in the case of non-noms, the regulator, in consultation with any working group that helped develop the measure, responds to the comments received by interested stakeholders and revises the draft regulation. In the case of noms, the National Standardization Consulting Committee that oversees the process of developing the draft nom must consider and respond to the comments received, explain why certain comments were not taken into account in the final nom, and publish its responses to comments in the Official Gazette at least 15 calendar days before the final nom is published. Step 3, Connemara analyzes the draft regulation. Connemara looks not just at the revised regulation, but it looks at the RIA and how the regulator considered the public comments, and then determines whether the draft complies with the ACR, the Regulatory Quality Agreement. As part of its review, Connemara looks at the cost-benefit analysis, the regulator's use of standards, its consideration of alternatives, and other factors. And then Connemara needs to provide one of the following opinions based on its review. It can approve the regulation, which means the regulation can be published in the Official Gazette, or it can request additional information from the regulator that justifies the draft regulation. And that process can go back and forth a few times. If in Connemara's opinion the RIA is unsatisfactory, it can request additional information from the regulator as well. And if you're going to ask for additional information on the RIA, Connemara needs to detail the specific elements of the RIA that require correction, explain the reasons why it considers that the RIA is incomplete or insufficient, and detail the type of corrections requested. If the regulator's corrections are sufficient in Connemara's opinion, Connemara prepares a final opinion approving the regulation, and it can be published in the Official Gazette. If the regulator's corrections are insufficient in Connemara's opinion, Connemara requests additional information from the regulator, and the process repeats itself until the regulator makes sufficient revisions to the measure such that Connemara will approve it, or the regulator prepares a justification as to why it will not follow Connemara's recommendations. Now, as previously mentioned, while Connemara's opinion is technically non-binding, as a practical matter, the regulator can't publish a regulation in the Official Gazette if it doesn't follow Connemara's recommendations, because Connemara can decide to withhold issuance of the final opinion. And you need that final opinion to publish the final in the Official Gazette. Step 4, the regulator publishes the final reg in the Official Gazette. And once Connemara has issued its final opinion, the regulator finalizes the regulation and publishes it, and it can enter into force unless it's a technical regulation that needs to be notified. Now, before we talk about notification, it's important to note that once the final has been published in the Official Gazette, the RIA and any correspondence between Connemara and the regulator are made public on Syria. Now, assuming the regulation is a technical regulation and needs to be notified, DGN notifies it to the WTO for a 60-day comment period. The regulator is required to take the comments into account. If the regulator substantially revises the regulation, it's obliged to send it back to Connemara to repeat step 3. But in reality, this doesn't always occur. The regulator publishes the final revised regulation after the comment period in the Official Gazette, normally with an effective date of not less than 6 months from publication. Let's say a few words about international regulatory cooperation. In Mexico, responsibilities are divided as follows. Connemara leads on horizontal regulatory cooperation issues. And as part of Connemara's role, it strongly promotes international regulatory cooperation, mostly with Latin American and Asia Pacific countries. And it does so through technical cooperation agreements. It helps organize and participate in international events, and it participates in fora such as APEC, Pacific Alliance, and OECD. So that's Connemara's role in IRC. DGN also participates in specific or sectoral regulatory cooperation activities when NOMs are involved. And Economia's Undersecretariat of Foreign Trade negotiates chapters on regulatory cooperation as part of free trade agreement negotiations. To this point, we've discussed Mexico's regulatory system prior to the general law on regulatory improvement. Now let's discuss the general law and how it may impact regulatory coherence in Mexico going forward. So the general law was promulgated and published in the Official Gazette on May 18th, 2018. Through the general law, the power of central coordination was extended throughout the entire territory of Mexico, creating arguably the most powerful central coordinating authority for regulation in the world. COFEMER became Connemara, a National Regulatory Improvement Commission versus Federal Commission, with the authority to review regulatory measures developed not just at the federal level, but at the state and municipal level as well. And there are going to be a number of coordination activities with respect to state and municipal regulatory issues, which will come into focus as the law is implemented. As part of the new architecture, the general law will require each state and municipality to create a central coordinating authority of its own on regulatory improvement, headed by a high-level official. With respect to the regulatory process, the new general law will define regulation in a broad manner to cover any legal instrument of general application issued by a federal, state, or municipal regulator. So this could include laws, regulations, criteria, norms, guidelines, and manuals. The general law will oblige all regulators at the federal, state, and municipal levels to publish a regulatory agenda twice per year and request public comment. The law will provide regulatory improvement authorities at all three levels with the power to block the issuance of a regulation in cases where the regulator doesn't modify its RIA to reflect the recommendations of the Regulatory Improvement Authority. It will mandate regulators at all three levels to conduct ex post RIAs every 5 years for regulations that impose compliance costs. And it will require regulators at the federal, state, and municipal levels to modify or repeal one regulatory obligation or act before promulgating a new one. With respect to the one-in, one-out requirement, in the draft regulation, under the general law, a regulator will need to indicate which regulations will be modified or eliminated such that the cost of compliance will be reduced in an amount that is equal or greater than the cost of compliance with the new obligations set out in the draft regulation, and provide relevant information in the RIA. The cost that is reduced must be related to the same regulated matter or sector. The obligation to offset the cost of a new regulation won't apply to certain measures, such as emergency regulations and regulations that by their nature must be issued or updated periodically. The relevant Regulatory Improvement Authority will assess whether the cost will be offset based on its analysis of the information provided by the regulator. If the authority determines that the cost will not be offset, the regulator cannot issue the regulation. The general law will also establish a national council. The council will comprise several ministers, a representative of the President of Mexico, the President of the Regulatory Improvement Observatory, which we'll discuss in a moment, the heads of 5 state regulatory improvement authorities, plus the head of Connemara. The council will develop an implementing regulation for the general law, including revised guidance for conducting regulatory impact analyses within 15 months of entry into force. And Connemara will be required to propose a national regulatory improvement strategy with a 20-year vision to the council within 30 days after the council has been installed. Other elements of note: the National Observatory of Regulatory Improvement. That will be comprised of highly respected citizens with honorary appointments. It will be established within 6 months after the council is installed to participate in the implementation of the general law and issue recommendations. Mexican states will have 1 year after the general law enters into force to pass new state laws to ensure compliance with the general law, and each state will install a state council within 90 days after passage of its respective implementing law. An electronic catalog will be created no later than 3 years after the general law enters into force that will publish in one location all regulations, permits, and formalities at the federal, state, and local levels of government in Mexico. A new complaint mechanism called the Citizens' Protest will be implemented. Under that new process, any person will be able to raise concerns with respect to the actions or inactions of a public servant. For instance, whenever an official of a regulatory agency does not provide a public service with sufficient quality, or the service is provided with delays without any unreasonable justification. Lastly, under the general law, Connemara becomes Mexico's international authority for regulatory improvement, with legal authority to sign international agreements with equivalent foreign agencies. So the key question is, how will the incoming administration implement the general law? It's clearly a very ambitious law and potentially transformative, and many details of implementation have yet to be written. So it's going to be very interesting to see. A second thing to look for is what's going to happen with NAFTA. Is there going to be a revised NAFTA? Is there going to be a U.S.-Mexico bilateral? If so, what will it say in the TBT chapter and on regulatory coherence and cooperation? Third, over the last several years, DGN has signed MOUs with several standards bodies. So one question is, how will that impact Mexico's use of international standards going forward? And will that approach change under a different Mexican administration? And fourth, it'll be interesting to see whether there'll be expanded regulatory cooperation work through the Pacific Alliance and or CPTPP and other types of agreements that Mexico might enter into. Thanks very much for watching this webinar. This brings it to a close. Thanks also to AdvaMed and ANSI for making this all possible, and to Aguilar y Luera in Mexico City, which provided invaluable assistance to Venable on this project. In closing, I'd like to note that the webinar is posted on the Standards Alliance website, standardsalliance.ansi.org, along with other related webinars in this series. You'll also be able to find there, both in English and Spanish, the manual and implementation guide on good regulatory design, the complete analyses of the regulatory systems of Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and the United States, documents that set out the life cycle of a regulation in each of those countries, and the slide decks and transcripts from all of the webinars. If after reviewing the materials you have additional questions or would like to discuss further, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the last slide. Thanks very much and have a great day.